Hello there! Recently I made a video about all the changes to the Jehovah's Witness religion in the few years since I left. And incidentally, I left around about 2010, 2011. That was when I started the process of doing research and waking up to the reality that the Jehovah's Witness religion essentially isn't true. And again, this video documented a number of ways in which the religion has changed, and thankfully a lot of you viewers were able to add a few extra changes in the comments. Bottom line, it's a very different religion from the religion that I grew up in, but I thought it would be interesting to, having looked at the changes to Jehovah's Witnesses, I thought it would be interesting to look at the changes to me personally. What has happened to me as a result of leaving the religion? How am I different as a person? And it was quite an interesting process writing down this list of ways in which I've changed, and to add a little bit of objectivity, because obviously we can all say, oh well, I've changed in this way and I've changed in that way, but it's one thing to have your own view on things, it's another thing entirely to have someone else's perspective. And so I went through this list with Deanna, my wife, and she agreed with the list and was also able to add a few extra insights. But there was quite an interesting list. It was quite a cathartic exercise. I would recommend it, in fact, to those of you who have yourselves woken up or have been out of the religion for a number of years. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to go through this list with you, because it could be that there are some of you watching who are at the very early stages of waking up to the reality that you've been lied to. And it might help to know what's ahead, because obviously we're all different. Just because I went through these changes doesn't mean you will, but it could be that it will help you to understand that it does change you, or it can change you as a person when you leave a religion. So one of the changes that I wrote down was that I'm less preoccupied with trivial matters. So for example, when I was a Jehovah's Witness and in the early stages of waking up from my Jehovah's Witness beliefs, I was very interested in doctrinal matters and issues related to Bible prophecy. Those were the most pressing issues for me when it came to the inconsistencies of my beliefs and figuring out whether it was true or not. I wasn't really so interested with larger issues such as shunning and such as the treatment of women. To my shame, I actually kind of went along with those things, because my logic was, as a Jehovah's Witness, well, if God gets to say basically what's right and what's wrong, and if God says that it's right to have this disfellowshipping procedure, or if God says that women have a certain role in the congregation or a certain role in a marriage, that's God's decision to make. And that was honestly my logic, because I was still a believer in God and the Bible. And it seemed as though those elements of the Jehovah's Witness faith could be supported by the Bible. Of course, I later found out that you can believe in the Bible and still have a healthy view of women and not feel as though they have to be some kind of second-class citizen. And you can also believe in the Bible and not agree with shunning. And in fact, there are a number of verses, thinking particularly of the parable of the prodigal son, which frankly contradict shunning as carried out by Jehovah's Witnesses. But at the time when I was a witness, I just went along with it. Whereas now I look back and think, how could I have been so immersed in the trivial things, in stuff to do with the King of the North, King of the South prophecy, and how could I have entirely missed these larger issues that affect people on a human level? So that's one way in which I've changed. I feel I've prioritized things a little better now. Along those lines, I also feel I'm more moral. So that's kind of rather ironic. When you are a Jehovah's Witness, you feel as though your religion is the pinnacle of morality. And if you were to leave, it would probably be because you want to live this life of debauchery and you want to live a life of immorality. The irony is that I actually feel more moral now that I'm no longer a Jehovah's Witness. I no longer crave the destruction of billions of men, women, and children for the crime of not agreeing with my beliefs. I no longer agree with the breaking up of families along religious grounds. I no longer agree that there can be any situation in which child abuse should be covered up. And I no longer agree that people should be persuaded to die rather than accept blood transfusions. So, ironically, I have become more moral since leaving the Jehovah's Witness religion. One thing I wasn't expecting was that I would become less selfish. And this is something that Deanna has kind of agreed with me on. She said that when you were a Jehovah's Witness, you used to give. You were a giving person, but you gave more out of duty, whereas now you instinctively give. You enjoy giving to people. And that is an odd change that I'm aware of. And I can't really explain it. It could be that I have more to give now that I'm no longer a broke pioneer and I'm not kind of devoting such a large percentage of my time to serving this organization so that I constantly don't have enough money. That could be one thing. But I do feel that aside from having more money to spend, there's more of an impulse to give than there was when I was a Jehovah's Witness. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but nevertheless, it is a way in which I've changed. I'm also more tolerant and open-minded. When you are a Jehovah's Witness, you look down on, for example, gay and lesbian people. You sympathize with verses such as Leviticus 20, verse 13, that even calls for gay people to be executed. You somehow manage to respect a God that could include a passage like that in the Bible. And it influences the way you look at people in your community who transgress the Bible or Jehovah's Witnesses' interpretation of the Bible in some way. You maybe look down on people who are smoking cigarettes, for example. And I feel as though now I have a much healthier attitude toward people I encounter, so that if someone, even though I'm not a smoker, if I do encounter someone who is a smoker, I'm not kind of looking down on them or thinking less of them for it. It's just, okay, they're a smoker, I'm not, big deal. So I'm definitely more tolerant and open-minded. I feel I'm more productive nowadays, and I think that that's due to the fact that I'm free to chase my passions, whatever my passions happen to be. Obviously, it turns out that my passion is to expose cults on YouTube and write books about my experience as a Jehovah's Witness, but it could easily have been a different passion. Just because you are an ex-Jehovah's Witness doesn't mean you are inclined to do this sort of thing. It could be that you want to be a singer or a painter, or you want to travel the world, for example. As a Jehovah's Witness, you are only allowed to pursue your passions to the extent that they don't conflict with your role, your life as a Jehovah's Witness. So, for example, when I was into my late teens and early 20s, I had a passion for music, and I would write songs. And I was even in a few wedding bands, and I did as much as I could with music, to the point of even recording albums and, you know, performing gigs and that kind of thing. I did as much as I could kind of get away with, But I always knew in the back of my mind that there was a limit. And even if it turned out that I was some amazing musician, which I don't think I am, by the way, but even if I had been extremely talented as a singer or musician, I wouldn't have been able to pursue that dream because the religion comes first. And I think that's really sad. And what it means is that you are always thinking about what Watchtower needs rather than what you need. And when you leave the witnesses and you stop worrying about Watchtower's demands and you are focused instead on what your needs are and making sure your needs are satisfied and including the needs of your loved ones, you just end up being more productive. You get more done, because you no longer have shackles telling you, well, you can be successful, but only to a point. If you are too successful, then you're disappointing God. So that's another way in which I feel I've changed. I'm definitely more productive with my time now. I also feel more socially and politically engaged. Of course, when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you feel as though Satan's world is doomed. You kind of sneer almost at attempts to improve humanity, to make advancement politically and scientifically. You just don't see any point in engaging in that process. But of course, when you leave Jehovah's Witnesses, you start to see merit in for example, pursuing environmental goals, in making sure our planet is better able to sustain humanity in the long term. You see merit in pursuing these issues, and so I definitely feel more politically and socially engaged than I was as a witness. I'm more interested in my family, not just my immediate family, but also my ancestors. Where did I come from? When I first started waking up from my beliefs, I actually even started writing down a family tree and trying to discover as much as I could about where I come from, because it occurred to me that once certain people in my family die who could remember things, that knowledge would be lost entirely, because of course I wasn't going to see them again in the resurrection. And so yes, that is another way in which I've changed. I'm interested in my family, not just my immediate family and making sure my family are well, but also understanding where I've come from so I can pass that knowledge on to future generations. Finally, I feel in terms of positives, I feel as though I am happier. And Diana said, you're less angry. She said when she used to go shopping with me when I was a witness, it was a nightmare because I used to kind of get really impatient and take my frustration out on people. And she said, you do that much less now. You're much more patient. And I feel overall that I am happier and more content and more satisfied with life. And I certainly feel as though my life has more purpose now. Because I feel as though, I mean, everyone finds their own purpose in life. But if you can find your passion and it's something that will help people, then that really helps you it really motivates you. And in my own case, I'm able to do this channel and write books that will hopefully help people in some way. So that's given me a great sense of purpose that I didn't really have as a witness, because I think in the back of my mind, I always had doubts as to whether this really was the truth or not. And when you have those doubts, it stops you from truly sensing that you are, that your life has meaning. So those are the positives, but there are, interestingly, some negatives. So I actually was able to think of 3 areas in which I am worse off, interestingly, since leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. And the positives far outweigh these negatives, but nevertheless, there are still negatives, if I'm being completely honest. For example, one negative, which doesn't have to affect everybody, but it certainly affects me, I'm not as fit as I was when I was a Jehovah's Witness. And I think part of that is aging. I'm always going to be fitter in my 20s than I am in my 30s. But I think if I were still a Jehovah's Witness, I would be fitter. I wouldn't have as much body weight, for example, because I'd be running around constantly. I'd be juggling my duties as a witness with my duties when it comes to providing for my family. Whereas now I basically spend all week more or less in the same room, and I'm either filming or I'm editing videos, neither of which really require much energy. So I have a deficit when it comes to exercise, which I'm trying to figure out how I can improve that. But I'm definitely not as fit, I feel, as I would be if I were a Jehovah's Witness, purely because of, again, the amount of running around you have to do when you're a JW. Although I'm probably healthier, because one thing I did do as a JW was drink more. I drank a lot when I was a Jehovah's Witness. Whether that was to cope with my predicament or not, I don't know. But I actually drink less now. I have nights during the week, or days during the week, sorry, when I don't drink at all. Because I think it's important to basically protect your body. You only get one body. So my attitude towards my body and health in general has improved. So I'm doing more to protect my health in other areas, but exercise is an area that I'm trying to think about. I also have fewer friends now that I'm no longer a Jehovah's Witness. And that's an interesting... You might be thinking, what on earth do you mean? Because you come across as this extrovert, kind of outgoing person. And when I'm in a social setting, for example, if we have a meetup and there are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses there, I do try and make an effort, and I usually get involved in conversations very easily. And I have friends who are former Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly those that I work closely with, and I have some friends who aren't former Jehovah's Witnesses as well. But I guess when you are in the Jehovah's Witness religion, friends are basically thrust at you, and friendship is compulsory, of course, so that you end up with a surplus of friends, people who you sort of know but don't know that well. And when I was a witness, I used to have astronomical mobile phone bills. I used to have bills running into the hundreds sometimes, because I was always texting people. I was always ringing people. Everything. I had a very active social life as a Jehovah's Witness. And that completely vanished when I left the Witnesses. I think it was partly due to moving to Croatia. And here where we live in Croatia, we're in the middle of nowhere. We're not in like an urban centre, so it's harder to meet people anyway. But nevertheless, I feel as though if I were a Jehovah's Witness, I would know more people, and I would quite likely have more friends. Ironically, even though due to this YouTube channel, lots of people know me or know of me. It's one thing to have people know of you. It's another thing for you to have people who you are close to. So I'm not asking you to kind of bombard me with friendship. I'm just explaining that it has had an impact on my social life. And I actually think that's one of the biggest challenges for people who leave any kind of high control group where there is this strong sense of community. It's a real challenge to rebuild your community and to find a substitute community. And I have had some success. Again, I do have some friends, but just not as many as I had before. And finally, in terms of negatives, I'm going to get really personal here, so please bear with me. I feel, ironically, I was talking before about being happier overall. I'm definitely happier with my life overall, but I'm also, ironically, more depressed. And this was something where I wrote it down, and I spoke to Deanna about it, and she basically confirmed that it was the same for her. And we were then both trying to grapple with, well, how could that be? How could it be that we're happier, but we're also more depressed? And just to clarify, when I'm talking about depression, I'm not talking about just being sad about stuff and stressed and that kind of thing. If anything, I'm less stressed now than I ever have been in my life. I don't worry about things as much. When I talk about depression, I'm talking about when your emotions overwhelm you. And there doesn't necessarily have to be a reason. In fact, there usually isn't a reason for this kind of wave of darkness, of negativity, but it hits you like a tsunami, and it renders you basically useless. You can't really do anything. All you can do is kind of disappear to your bed and try to be unconscious for a while and hope that when you wake up, your mood will be better. But I do definitely struggle with that, and so does Deanna. And we didn't have a problem with that when we were Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's hard to understand how that could be. Why would that be? And one possible explanation that we've come up with is shunning, because shunning is such and I'm not saying that all of my depression is because of shunning. I'm just trying to explain some of the possible reasons. But human beings are social creatures. We have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, we have, in social settings, in hunter-gatherer groups, in small communities, in villages, and we're used to being surrounded by people. And when someone turns their back on you, we can't help it but feel as though we've been wounded in some way, and especially when it's your family. And in my case, I lost my mother when I was still a witness, but my father is shunning me. And recently we were in the UK, and I gave my dad another opportunity to see his granddaughter, who he still hasn't met. Jessica's now 4 years old. A lot of you will have seen her in the video where I interviewed Deanna recently. And it definitely affected me, because we drove through my old town and drove past the house and took a few pictures of Jessica outside my old house. And even though my feelings for my father have changed, I no longer feel the same way about Dad as I used to. And I think that's kind of like a defense mechanism to some extent. It still just punches you in the guts when you think about it. And you think about the way you've just been marginalized and ostracized purely for taking a stand on conscientious grounds, and the fact that Jessica is suffering in some way as well, even though she doesn't realize it. So definitely shunning has an impact, and I think it has a profound impact that I'm not always conscious of. And I think that could be one reason why I get depressed. It could be. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. But definitely, on the whole, I'm happier. And the only way I can describe it is that when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you kind of live in this emotional bubble where everything's very carefully controlled. Everything's very sterile. You're kind of injected with artificial friendship to give you this feeling of belonging, even though it's entirely conditional. It's all very synthetic. It's fake. It's not real. And then when that bubble bursts and you're suddenly ejected out into reality, you suddenly are experiencing the full spectrum of emotion, from genuine happiness that results from intellectual freedom, freedom to think for yourself, freedom to follow your dreams, freedom to do what you want with your life, and all of the happiness that comes with that. You have that on one side of the spectrum, And on the other side of the spectrum, you have problems that only you can deal with, and that you can no longer outsource to some sky daddy who's going to swoop down and magically solve everything, either now or at some future point. So basically, I feel as though I experience a broader range, a broader spectrum of emotion now than I perhaps did as a Jehovah's Witness, or at least that's the way I think of it now. Maybe I'll think of things differently in the future, or I'll come up with other ways of explaining things, but that seems to be how things work at the moment. But overall, the positives far outweigh the negatives. I don't want to remotely come across as though I regret leaving the Jehovah's Witness organization, because there's bound to be setbacks whenever you make any decision in life. There's bound to be consequences that will affect you in ways that you can't always expect. But the net result of leaving Jehovah's Witnesses has been unquestionably positive. And I would make the same decision again in a heartbeat. I only wish I'd done it sooner, in fact. So I thought it might be interesting to go through some of the ways in which I've changed as a person since leaving the religion. Maybe some of you can relate to the things I've said, or maybe you can think of ways in which you have changed. By all means, express yourself in the comments below. Or again, maybe you are just in the early stages of waking up from your indoctrination and you want to know what's ahead of you, or at least what might be ahead of you if things turn out remotely the same for you as they were for me. But I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos, and as always, thank you for watching.